So while people are finding their seats, I'll start with a true story. Happened in Sinai at the same time as I was filming for that Moses program. The director thought it would be brilliant to have me driving in a Jeep, which we were driving around. They were filming me. And they thought it would be brilliant to have the Jeep go over back of this mountain and come down on it was like a saddle, an igneous saddle with granite mountain and sand, like the desert had just blown into it. They thought it'd be very dramatic to show me driving across the desert and coming up over this hill. My driver was a Bedouin, and Bedouin is the desert people who live, right, the Arabs who live in the desert. And we were driving around the back, and I talking to him in Arabic, and I said, "Look, I'm a little worried about this. Looks pretty steep." He said, "It's nothing to worry about." I said, "Have you done this before?" "No." We got up the top, and he looked down, I looked down. We got back in, camera ready, and I said, "Look, take it easy. I don't want to die today." I said, "I have a wife and 2 kids." He said, "Don't worry. I have 3 wives and 15 kids. I don't want to die either." We made it, and for all his bluster, when the director said, "Can we do it again?" he said, "No." Anyway, that took place right about in there. Anyway, where is Mount Sinai and why it doesn't matter? We could spend a lot of time talking about this. Can we make, I don't know, if some of these lights can go out. You don't need to see, oh, you're filming me, okay. I just want you to see as much as possible. But this is the Sinai Peninsula, of course, between Egypt and Arabia here and Israel and Canaan off to the north. And I've located on this map some of the Mount Sinai candidates. And you can see they're all over the place, various kind of mountains, various locations. And most recently, I imagine many of you in this room have heard about locating Mount Sinai in Arabia. We'll come back to that a little bit later. One of the problems we have today, and maybe it's not just today, but even in earlier times, again, the attempt to locate Mount Sinai has been with us a long time. The last person we know who successfully got there was Elijah. And after that, we have no record of anybody positively identifying where they went. Unfortunately, Elijah didn't leave much details. It was during the reign of Constantine in the early 4th century when Christianity was accepted and his mother Helena had converted that she made it her life's work to identify important Christian sites to biblical history. And one of them she wanted to find out was Mount Sinai. And she sent these, I guess you could say they're clergy, Bible scholars, looking around for different sites. And they ended up in South Sinai. And then when they got there, apparently the claim is there were monks already living in the area saying, well, this is Mount Sinai. And these traditions have been with us in some cases for 1,700 years, 1,500 years. But in any event, the mistake that many people make, and it's being made right now, especially with those who favor location of Mount Sinai in modern Arabia, Saudi Arabia that is to identify a mountain and they say, okay, now let's figure out how the Bible data fits in to get to this location. In other words, you start with, you don't, well, maybe we do that with GPS now. We know where we're going and we figure out how to get there. But it doesn't really work that way in historical geography. You have to start from going from the known and move to the unknown and try to follow the details, the instructions, etc. Now, the Bible does provide us important details about the journey, both in the book of Exodus and then also in the book of Numbers. Numbers 33 is, again, one of those chapters you might not want to read in your quiet time tomorrow morning. It says, these are the stages of the people of Israel when they went out of the land of Egypt by their companies under the leadership of Moses and Aaron. Moses wrote down their starting places stage by stage. Every campsite they went, he wrote the name down. The problem is some of the names come out of the story. When they contended with God, the place was called Meribah. So when they started the trip, there was no place called Meribah or Mara, and so on and so forth. But anyway, so some of the names you just can't identify them from previous records. But be that as it may, he writes down, they set out from Ramses, okay? In the first month, the 15th day of the first month. So we know where they started from. And here's what's helpful to if you can get your mind wrapped around this, and that is that they start at Ramses, and we've located that up here in the northeastern delta. We'll come back again. And we're told, again, if you read through Numbers 33, 3 and 5, it says they left from Ramses, they went to Sukkot, and Sukkot they went to Etam, and then they camped at Migdol, which was beside the sea. After they crossed the sea, they traveled, it says 3-day journey, probably meaning these 3 stops, Mara, Elam, Yam Suf, Desert of Sin, Dofka, Alush, Rephidim, and the desert of Sinai, or wilderness of Sinai, before reaching Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb. Now, if you just looked at that, you would have to conclude that where they crossed the sea is much closer to their starting point than where they crossed the sea is to the end point, right? So basically they traveled 3 stops before they reached the sea, whereas after they crossed the sea, they traveled 9 days with campsites at every place. And the word they use is to pitch their tents. They camped is the word that's used. So right away, we should be able to figure out that where they cross the sea has to be fairly close to the starting point. Okay, this is just going through important data. I've given you Numbers 33. From Numbers 15, 22 to chapter 19, gives you the count of where they're traveling in Sinai. There's another very important datum, and that is Deuteronomy 1:2, which says it's an 11-day journey from Mount Horeb to Kadesh Barnea. And they went by the way of Etzion Gebir, which is a very important clue because we know that's a port on the very north end of the Gulf of Aqaba. Kadesh Barnea's location is fairly certain, and so we do have some firm points we can put on a map. Now, here are proposed Red Sea crossing locations, and they are as numerous as Mount Sinai locations. And you can see they vary from way up north here, way up north here. There was a lake Manzella, today it's called, Lake Sirbonis here in Sinai, the Balach Lakes, Lake Timsah, the Bitter Lakes, the north end of the Gulf of Suez, the north end of Gulf of Aqaba, midway between this into Arabia and another from the southern tip into Saudi Arabia. So there are no shortages of Red Sea location crossings. Okay, so our task is to answer the question, what is a day's journey? That's how they measured travel distances. It wasn't by miles or kilometers, or even like in Roman times, there was a Roman mile and so on. But travel was reckoned based on how much time it would take for you to get from point A to point B. In a 12-hour walking day would be a day's journey. Now, when we see pictures of people traveling, and this is, by the way, is from South Sinai. It's carved on a rock. And here we have a very important man who's called the brother of the prince of Rechenu, which is a word for Syria. And his name is Chebdedem. That's a nice name to call your kid. But notice he's the big wheel who's riding the donkey, but he's being led. And here's a guy prodding the donkey with a stick, and the guy's pulling him along. In other words, even if you have a donkey, you're not going faster than you could walk under normal conditions. There was a time when Muhammad Ali was somewhere in, I'm not sure exactly where he was, whether he was in the southern part of Palestine or Jordan. And he, under an emergency circumstance with camels, he flew back to Cairo for whatever the issue was. And it said that he made a 5-day journey in 3 days. So he was really going fast, because normally it would take 5 days, but he was in a hurry. So it's interesting, they still thought about that in more recent history. Another picture we have of foreigners traveling is in a tomb in Beni Hassan, near where I grew up in Egypt. And this painted scene is very famous because the people traveling with these very different looking beards, clothes, and so on, are Amorites. They're from Syria, Canaan, same as the Amorites that are mentioned in the Bible. And you'll notice that they're all walking, except you have donkeys carrying equipment and little kids and equipment. So even a young kid, probably preteen, is walking and protecting the ladies with his spear, as you can see. Quite a guy. So my point is that most travel in the ancient times was walking speed, even if you were riding. So how much could be covered in a day? Now, a lot of study has gone into this based on ancient texts. We know that caravans traveled from point A to point B. We know where those sites are and how long it took them to get there. We figure out the distance. These kind of studies have been going on for quite a long time. And to summarize, it's thought that somewhere between 15 and 23 miles could be covered in a day, again, depending on conditions. But that gives you at least a framework. So I use the average of 32 kilometers or 20 miles a day, recognizing it could be a little more or could be a little less, again, depending on conditions. But that gives you a framework for understanding. So again, we go back to our beginning point, and we're told the Israelites left Ramesses. 3 different verses mention that, and went to Sukkot. That's their first stop. And then in Exodus 13:20, we're told they moved on from Sukkot and encamped at Etam on the edge of the wilderness. They're about to leave Egypt. They're almost in the wilderness of Sinai. And then something weird happens. Tell the Israelites to turn back. Hebrew, shuv. This is a word that's used in the prophets, especially meaning to repent. You turn back. You're walking down this way in sin, and you turn back and you go the opposite way. Okay? So, but shuv literally means to make, almost like make a U-turn. So turn back and camp in front of Ahirot, between Migdol and the sea, in front of Baal Zephon. You shall come opposite it by the sea. So here we have 3 different places named, Pi-Hahirot, Migdol, Baal Zephon, which means Baal, the god Baal of the north. That's a particular manifestation of the god Baal, the storm god, and by the sea. And this, of course, is the sea through which they will pass. Now, if you just take that introductory information, Ramses to Sukkot to Etam to Migdol, with a turn back in there, we're talking about 3 days and a range possibly around 100 kilometers, 60 miles, again, plus or minus a few. So we're not that far from the starting point. Now, for the sea, we're somewhere between 8 and I would say 9, preferably 9 days. But the range could be as little as 160, as much as 220 miles. That's the number of campsites between crossing the sea and reaching Mount Horeb. Then we have the other datum, and that is the 11-day journey from Mount Sinai to Mount Horeb, to Kadesh Barnea. So this gives you an idea of the range of travel that 60 miles will get you from Ramesses within that red circle. You see why distances down here, crossing into Arabia, don't work. Now, some of you may be aware of this, but others may not. When the Bible refers to the sea of crossing, and there are a number of references, the Hebrew term is yam, which means sea, Suf. The word Yam, sea, can mean anything from the Mediterranean to the big bowl for purification in the temple was called the Bronze Sea. Remember that in Solomon's temple? So a big, huge bowl could be called a Yam, sea. So the word Yam doesn't have anything to do with size, okay? It's an enclosed body of water. But the Hebrew Yam Suf means sea of reeds, and Exodus 10:19, Exodus 13:18, Exodus 15:4 and 22 name the sea. These are all references that refer to the sea that the Israelites crossed as Yam Suf, sea of reeds. Most of our English translations, however, render it as Red Sea. So I can just see the eager beaver mind out there saying, aha, reed, R-E-E-D, red, R-E-D. Oh, somebody just slashed off an E. Well, that's nice in English. It doesn't work in Hebrew. Suf means red. Suf means reed. Everybody knows the Hebrew word for red? You didn't go to Sunday school? Edom. All right. Yes, it's not only Edom like on the red cheese, but yes, Edom. Remember the brother of Jacob, Esau, was called Edom because the red. Okay. Yes, good for you. Okay, enough of that. So, the other interesting thing is that the Hebrew word Yam Suf, actually, the word Suf, reed, is an Egyptian word for reeds, which you have in the marshes and along the sides of the Nile. So, for instance, when Moses' mother puts him in a basket made of goma, which is papyrus, it's the Egyptian word for papyrus. They made the basket out of papyrus and placed it in the water amongst the same word. Okay? Same word. Okay. Now, here is a map that was made many years ago and embellished recently with color by a man I deeply respect, Manfred Bietak, a professor at the University of Vienna. And he made this originally in 1975, and he was excavating over in here. And this is Pi-Ramesses, the Ramesside capital. And off to the east here is a body of water that we know from Egyptian texts, and it's called Pa-Tufi, the reed or marshlands, depending how you want to translate it. We have Egyptian texts that refer to this body of water. You may not be able to read it. You probably can't anyway because it's too small, and then it's written in hieroglyphs. So that's a further obstacle. But he actually labels it by the hieroglyphs, Pa-Tufi. And why I think that is interesting is that when the plague of the locusts strike Egypt, when God removes them, he creates a west wind blowing west to east, and it says they are blown into the Sea of Reeds. So if a west wind is blowing across the land, look what's sitting there. I know what you're thinking. That's just a little puddle. How could that happen? Well, let's try to locate this further. This is an Egyptian text called the onomasticon. That might be your word of the day. How many know the word onomasticon? It's a good Scrabble word. You won't get many points, though. Onomasticon means a list of names. It's like a dictionary without definitions, but you just have lists of names. And they're categorized by type. And this onomasticon has different categories, one of them which is the cities of Egypt. And it starts from the way south in Aswan and moves all the way north, mentioning Ramses and Tanis. And then, here's the list. I'm going to skip. I'm not going to do all 100 whatever. So Ramses, we know, is up north. Tanis is north of that. And then it says Yam Suf. And then north of that is Charu or Sile. This is a major entry point to Egypt. This were the forts that protected Egypt from people coming from Canaan. This is a recent geological map made by my partner who worked with us in North Sinai between 1994 and 2008. I was very active working, doing archaeological work and collaborating with a geologist, good friend and colleague, Dr. Stephen Mosier from Wheaton College. And he made this map based on the work he did. I will show him at work a little bit later. This is my buddy Steve. This is an area, let me try to back that up just a second. Was taken here. Most of this lake is gone now. It's agriculture or towns. Because after the Suez Canal was carved through this area, all the lakes drained out. And today, the water is completely gone, except for a few patches here. And notice where there is a little bit of water, what happens. Look at the reeds. This is the very place that the Egyptians called the marshlands or the reed lands and so on. We did some interesting work. We worked with the Geological Survey of Egypt, and we asked them to supply a geologist to collaborate with our guy. The first year we had a very nice guy from the survey. In the second year we were assigned another man, and that's him there. And he is an elder in a Presbyterian church in Cairo, Dr. Baha Gaed. And it's wonderful to work with a brother in Christ in the sands of Egypt. And this is the ancient lake bed. And you can see here's the Suez Canal. These are the depressions from the lake. And all these dots represent where they drilled, try to understand the history of this lake. You can still see some of the area of it in satellite imagery today, where that was. So here's our map, and here is Ramesses. I'm sorry, the color is not so good. And they traveled from Ramesses to Sukkot. Sukkot, or Sukkoth, if that's what you're saying, is the name of what is known today in Arabic as the Wadi Tumilat. The Wadi Tumilat is this, you might figure out yourself by just looking at it. It's an ancient branch of the Nile flowed out of there and carved a little bit of a depression. And so you can see it's still very green in there because there are canals and there's a lot of agriculture going on now. But this was one of the ways out of Egypt. We'll get to there in a minute. Tel el-Maskuta is the name of a particular site. A village today is Arabic Maskuta. And notice the word Sukkot in the Arabic name. In other words, sometimes the ancient name of the site continues to be preserved in the modern name. That hasn't changed. Just like Bethlehem is still Bethlehem. Jerusalem is still Jerusalem after thousands of years. And on it goes. Damascus is Damascus as we knew it 4 millennium ago. Anyway, so there are two roads out of Egypt. Here's Ramses over here. This is the road that you would take if you're going to Canaan. It's called the way of the land of the Philistines, the road to the Philistine territory. Roads in ancient times were named by their destination. We still do that, right? What's Route 340 in Lancaster called? Old Philadelphia Pike. What? It's the destination, right? So they did the same thing. There you go. There you go. Well, good. Thank you. And the second road in and out of Egypt is here. And it's called the way of the land of Shur. We don't know anything about this from Egyptian sources. We know about it from the Bible. This is the road that Abraham traveled on to Egypt. This is the road Hagar was on when she was going back to Egypt, fleeing. And the angel found her. Found her at a well somewhere around in here, not too far from Kadesh. And here is the wilderness of Shur. So that's why it's called the way of Shur. You go to Shur and then into Egypt. Those are the two main roads in and out of Egypt. Okay. Now, why that's significant is that the Bible explicitly says God didn't send them by the way of the land of the Philistines. And we know why. There were forts all along that road. I had the joy of discovering one of them. 2 different forts, same site, spanning from about 1450 BC down to about 1100 BC. 2 forts, one built after the other, to defend Egypt's border. So bearing in mind that we're somewhere out here, if I'm right, that the Bala Depression, and by the way, I should point out, when we surveyed it, we found the actual banks of the lake, the northern banks of the lake. And we ran our survey equipment, and we went out 300 meters, and the drop in elevation was close to 20 feet. So it was not a puddle. The other thing we learned too is that this lake system had a flow from the Nile. There was a Nile branch that flowed into it. And the reason we know that is because the soils we collected in the lake were Nilotic soils. So we discovered a number of interesting things, including a branch of the Nile that came out of it and went right by our site. We were digging the site, and all of a sudden we came across this black stuff in the middle of the desert. And it's a Nile branch. Nobody ever knew about it before. Okay. Now, here is a map trying to show you what I gave you the Bible verses for before in terms of the days of travel, et cetera, et cetera. So, here's your 60-mile circuit. Somewhere in here would be where the crossing was. From that point, if it's somewhere in here, it's about 160 to 180 miles. That would be 9 days of travel. Would take us anywhere within down into this area. Kadesh Barnea, 11 days journey would be about 220 miles. You have a much bigger circle there. So anywhere inside of that, that's pretty, gives you a lot of options. But again, bear in mind, these are straight arrows, and the roads of this area, none of them are straight. They wind, they follow valleys, they meander, etc. But what this suggests to me is when you combine all this data, a location in the southern part of Sinai seems to make sense based on this numerical data. Again, I'm not, what my putting this data together allows us to do is eliminate implausible candidates. This is the wilderness of Paran that leads to Kadesh Barnea. It's very hard to get there because you have to go through several UN checkpoints. And I got to go there in 2001, and just on the other side of Kadesh Barnea is the Israeli border. So it's a very secure area. But this is Kadesh Barnea, and you can see how nice and green it is. It's one of the best sources of water in the whole region of Sinai. Not surprisingly, much of the 40 years or 38 years spent in Israel after leaving Mount Sinai was in and around Kadesh Barnea. It's a good source of water. Here's the stream that comes out of the spring, and at present day, some of the locals do some farming. It's quite successful there. Now, I want to take on this matter of Mount Sinai in Arabia. I don't know, is that something some of you read about, got videos about, had somebody speak in your church about? Is that, you run into that at all? Good. For some, it begins with what Paul says in Galatians 4. Paul says, now this is an allegory. First rule of interpreting Scripture, if it tells you it's an allegory, you don't take it literally, right? I mean, an allegory is not meant to be taken literally, so it's not a good start. Anyway, these two women, that is Sarah and Hagar, represent two covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, bearing children of slavery. She is Hagar. Now, Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. And that, for some, then, is, okay, let's run to Saudi Arabia and see where this might have taken place. Now, as early as the time of Herodotus, the Greek historian traveler, he traveled from Egypt and was going into Palestine, and he approaches Sinai, and he refers to, when you leave Egypt, you come into Sinai of Arabia. So from the days of at least the 5th century BC, maybe earlier, all the way down to Paul's time, when you use the word Arabia, it included Sinai. The mistake people have made is to look at a modern geopolitical map and look where Saudi Arabia is today. as you all know, I think, or should know, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, almost all these countries, the present boundaries were established in 1947. Okay? So, but where they were at earlier times is very... Now, this is a map made by a scribe geographer named Beatus. And I'm going to zoom in because, okay, this is the Mediterranean. And zoom in a little bit over here. And it's very odd map. But hey, he didn't have satellite imagery, did he? So here's Egypt. Here's the Nile. And you cross over. Here's Philistia. Judah. This must be the Dead Sea bent around in the Sea of Galilee. Okay? And look at this big tall mountain. It's Mount Sinai. And where is it? Arabia. Okay? And notice that the Red Sea down here is red. So a beautiful illustration of how people tried to reconstruct geography. They were interested in the questions we're interested in, and this is 1,200 or 1,200 years ago. So the big canyon everybody's huffing and puffing about is called Jebel al-Lawz, and they posit a crossing of the sea either up here at Nuweiba or down here in the Gulf of Tiran to go to Jebel al-Lawz in Saudi Arabia. This is a case of identifying your mountain and trying to make the biblical data work backwards. It doesn't work very well. I'm really sorry, I don't know why, but if I can show you, here are three of the more famous people who have written books, made videos, and these people do, well, he passed away unfortunately, but they're all good-hearted people. They want to find the truth. They're just not qualified, really, is the problem. Ron White, ever heard of him? Yeah, so he looks like Indiana Jones, but he's a nurse anesthetist. I want one of those when I'm having surgery. I don't want him out in Sinai pretending to be an archaeologist. But anyway, leave that alone. Look at the routes they propose. Going from Ramesses way over here, down here. Here's the Shuv, that little is the turning back. Then they come down here. That's over 300 miles. And that represents what the Bible covers in 3 days. That means traveling about 80 to 90 miles a day rather than 20. Okay. The other route, I think this was Wyatt's. He had him going down the coast and crossing down here and going up to Jebel al-Lawz. But again, 300 miles to get to just to get to the crossing point. And remember, the biblical data is it's a short distance from where you start to the sea and a longer distance from the crossing of the sea to get to Mount Sinai. All right. I'm just going to move on a little bit faster here. I think the land of Midian, where Moses stayed as a sojourner, where he met his wife. Good things happen when you're in the desert. He meets his wife, he meets his father-in-law, etc. We know that story well. And when they came to meet Moses at Mount Sinai, and by the way, the whole position of Mount Sinai in Arabia is that Moses is in Midian, tending his father's flock, and that's where Mount Sinai is. Right? That's the thesis. Therefore, Mount Midian is Arabia. But if you look at this, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came to this is at Mount Sinai, and brought his wife and his kids in the wilderness where he was camped at the mountain of God. And when he sent word to Moses, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming with your wife and your sons, etc. After the visit is over, then Moses let his father-in-law depart, and he went away to his own country. Clearly, where he meets Moses is not in the land of Midian. Maybe adjacent to it, but it's not the land of Midian. So the Bible itself never refers to the location of Mount Sinai in the Midian. It mentions Midian in other contexts, but never in the context of the Exodus. Same thing with Hobab, who is the brother-in-law of Moses. Moses says, hey, we're about to leave. We're going to the promised land. Come with us. We'll do good to you. We'll give you a cut of the land. And what does Hobab say? But he said to him, I will not go. I will depart my own land. I will depart to my own land and my kindred. I want to stay back home. I don't want to go with you. Again, he's at Mount Sinai, Moses is, and Hobab says, I'm going back home. Well, we find out in later history he actually did join, because you remember the story of Jael clubbing and killing the poor general of Hatzor. We learn that she was a descendant of Moses' kin, the Hobab. There's another thing that's a problem for those who want to have the Israelites crossing through central Sinai, is that this is the hottest, driest area of Sinai. Impossible to traverse. And if you look, sorry about that, there is a highway that goes through today, but it's a modern highway with bulldozers, etc. All right, I'm going to, I want to get to the end. Okay, this is a map I just created last week, and it shows you that if you're traveling from Egypt to Canaan, this band of desert is where you have the two routes that connect Egypt to Canaan or Israel. The central part, all the wadis, the rain valleys, when it does rain, which is rare, all travel north and south. In other words, traveling east to west across here would be going like this. Now, can you imagine Pharaoh and his chariots going like this in pursuit for 300 miles? I don't think so. There's very little water and no support for chariotry and all of that. When you get to the southern part, notice that the valleys go east and west. So again, this is an unlikely pace to travel. This is a pace to travel. Across here is another place to travel. And I'm going to skip through this. This is all the geology stuff you may not be interested in. I do want to get to the second half of the football game. But anyway, no, I want you to be awake tomorrow morning. Yeah, okay, I'm going to, okay. So look how difficult this would be to travel in these valleys. Look at all these boulders. These boulders are there because when it does rain in South Sinai, because the mountains are granite, the water runs down and gets in the valley, soaks into the sand, and there are all kinds of wells. But you get all kinds of boulders, again, making it very difficult to travel. Again, you know, it's impossible to imagine Egyptian chariots going across that. And if you're looking for a burning bush, I could arrange that. Anyway, this is the mountains where the turquoise came from. And some have suggested this could be where the Israelites encountered God, at this mountain at Serebit el-Kadem. This is the temple that's there because the Egyptians for centuries were coming here to mine for copper and turquoise. You can see all kinds of Egyptian inscriptions. Here's a pharaoh making an offering to the goddess Hathor, the goddess of turquoise we've already talked about. And I'm going to skip over. Several of the caves here where the quarrying took place, the mining took place, has some of the earliest Hebraic-styled writing. And this text, which dates to well before the time of Moses by a couple centuries, reads El Olam, God the Eternal, which you find in the book of Genesis. God the Eternal. And why this is fascinating here is you encounter alphabet. This is alphabetic writing. So that by the time of Moses, when God is delivering the law and inspiring him to write, we have an alphabetic script that had only come on the scene just a few centuries before Moses' time. And the earliest texts we find are in Sinai. So again, that's a rather interesting correlation. All right, the traditional location of Mount Sinai is somewhere in the south here, and there are two different mountains that I believe are plausible. The one goes through the Wadi Firan, and Wadi Firan, as early as the 3rd century, had Christians living there. There was a bishop there. One of the bishops of Firan was at Nicaea, which is interesting enough. We're celebrating the 1700th anniversary of Nicaea next year. So Gebel Sirbal and Gebel Musa, here is the Wadi Firan, which the Israelites would have passed through. And if the reconstruction is correct, this is the second most watered region of Sinai. And for those who hold to this southern location, see this as an excellent place for the battle with the Amalekites. And what were they fighting over? Access to water. And you can imagine if the Amalekites are sitting here, they don't want to let the Israelites have it, so the Israelites had no water. War breaks out. Moses popped up on one of these mountains, like here, holds his arms up, etc. You remember the story well. And what do we have here? All kinds of Christian monasteries, old churches, because Christians in Egypt early believed that this was a holy area connected to the biblical stories. And as you go through the wadi, this Wadi Firan, this waterway, you can see peeking out over the top the high peaks of Gebel Sirbal, Mount Sirbal. Here is a Google Earth picture of it. And on the base of it, there are all kinds of Armenian inscriptions of Armenian Christian pilgrims who came there believing that was Mount Sinai. This would be from the 6th, 7th, 8th century. And so there were two traditions. One that Christians believe from earliest times, and that's why you still to this day have a Coptic nunnery in the Wadi Firan. Whereas the nearby one more day journey to the area called Jebel Musa, Mount Moses, which you can see here. One end of it here, and it goes back. Tradition says back here is where Moses was. This is where St. Catherine's Monastery was. This is where St. Helena, Queen Helena's savants came and encountered monks. And they believed that that was Mount Sinai. Here's the front of this. There's the back of the mountain. And here is the middle. Between, it's like a saddle. And the monks will tell you that this is where Moses and the 70 elders met when they had their meal before God, etc. Okay, I'm going to move along quickly here. Yes, and this is the Chapel of the Burning Bush. They claim this bush has been growing there for over 3,000 years. And one day I was there with a friend who reached up and touched it, and he got zapped from heaven. I cannot explain this picture. If any of you can tell me what happened, I did not see this happen. When we got the picture, there it was. So Steve, don't touch holy. Anyway, he didn't take his shoes off. Okay. So we can only say, because there's really no archaeological datable evidence to tie any of these mountains to Moses and the Israelites. The locations, as I've tried to work out the miles and the distances from starting point, it seems to me that South Sinai makes good sense. It's one of the most watered areas because of the mountains. As I said, when it does rain and it does snow, you do get lots of wells. So there's water sources there. But why doesn't it matter? Again, some people are dead bent set on trying to find Mount Sinai as if, we find Mount Sinai, the Lord's going to come back. Some silly like that. But Mount Sinai is where God first revealed his glory to the people of Israel. And his glory settled on the mountain. Exodus 24:16 says. The Hebrew word for settle is the word shakain, where we get the word Shekinah. The Shekinah glory is the glory of God that settles on the mountain, and Moses is up there encountering God. And we read, now the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like devouring fire on the top of the mountain in the sight of the people of Israel. Exodus 25 then gives us, interesting, right after this, the instructions for the tabernacle. So we go through all that, and we find our cute little words I was telling you about, and we get up with our tabernacle. Once the tabernacle became the sanctuary, God's glory moved into the tabernacle. And after the sanctuary is set up, Moses never climbs the mountain again. He meets God, encounters God in the tabernacle. In 2 Samuel, when David wants to build a temple, Nathan the prophet has to correct his initial enthusiasm for a temple by saying, I have not lived in a house since the day I brought the people out of Egypt, to this day. But I have been moving about in a tent for my dwelling. God wanted to be with his people. He didn't want to be stuck on the top of a mountain or even stuck in a temple. as beautiful as the temple must have been. Here's a reconstruction of it in the ESV Study Bible, for which I was a consultant and helped with some of the details. Basically what happens is that Mount Sinai, where God's glory was, the glory departed. God's glory went with his people. And when the temple is set up, we learned that, getting ahead of myself. Psalm 78 says, He, God, chose the tribe of Judah, Mount Zion, which he loves. He built his sanctuary like a high heavens, like the earth which was founded upon. And we get to 1 Kings chapter 8. When the temple is being dedicated, two things happen of significance. Number one, the glory of God invades the temple. Number two, and I guess I don't have that verse. Sorry. Number two, we're told that the remnant of the original tabernacle, the tent of meeting, was taken into the temple. So the idea is that the continuity of God's revelation moved from Mount Sinai to the tabernacle, from the tabernacle to the temple, and then in Ezekiel we read, the glory is departed. The glory is gone. The temple is destroyed. Habakkuk talks about how the glory of the later temple will surpass the first temple. And so just before the temple was destroyed, 586 BC, you see the references in Ezekiel to the glory of God departing. But God's glory reappears in the incarnation. Remember what John writes in John 1, we beheld his glory. Same word, the word doxa in Greek is the same word as in the Septuagint for the word kavod, glory. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. So my admonition is when you meet somebody who's all wired up about locating Mount Sinai, wherever that is, it's not that big a deal. It's for me as a historian archaeologist, it's great. But the ultimate is the glory of God which appeared in Christ, has that appeared to you? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Tom, Martin is going to come and lead us in our closing hymn.